Today I want to talk about Augustine on memory. Memory is something that is of perennial interest to philosophers, though always in a fairly minor way. Aristotle talks about memory, Plato talks about memory. The early modern philosophers, Locke and especially Hume, say some things about memory. But overall it has not been a very large topic of philosophical conversation. It's something that is discussed in minor ways by various thinkers throughout the history of philosophy. It's rarely been a major focus. However, for Augustine in this book, The Confessions, it's a pretty vital topic. Why? Because he's writing for us the first autobiography. And it's an autobiography that depends on memory. He has to recall his previous life. And as we'll see, memory is important for him in much deeper ways than this. But at the very least, it is central to the very project of writing an autobiography. One of the things you have to think about in writing a biography, whether it's of yourself or someone else, is what is this book really about? The person, obviously, but beyond that, what exactly is the story you want to tell? You've got to take somebody's life and turn it into some kind of narrative. And some people, like Nietzsche, I think we ought to live in a way that makes our life a narrative. I think that's probably a mistake. Lives are not narratives. But the biographer has the task of telling a narrative through the story of that life. And so in the process, you have to recall, or in the case of someone else, investigate, and learn enough about the person's life that the shape of some narrative, or maybe a series of narratives, begins to form. You can see something about the development. There's some reason why you're choosing to write a biography of that person. And so there's got to be some story to be told there. Something that allows you to say, there is a structure here that I want to reveal. Well, in doing that for oneself, it's especially hard, because you have to not only recall events of your life, you have to think about the meaning of your own life. And that's a hard thing for most of us to do. We might be able to recount some of the major things that have happened in our lives, but if somebody says, well then what does it all mean? What's the moral of the story? That's a much harder question. Here, I want to get to that, but I want to focus on what he has to say about memory, because it's really a fascinating topic. He realizes that in order to do this project of engaging in the Confessions, this sort of autobiographical excursion and prayer before God, he needs to rely on his memory. Is memory reliable, however? And he focuses not just on that epistemic question, but in general on what's going on in memory. And he starts realizing how puzzling it is. So let's take a look at the beginning of Book 10. What could be hidden within me, even if I were unwilling to confess it to you? It would be hiding you from myself, not myself from you. The idea here, of course, is that God knows him completely. God knows each one of us to the depths of our soul. But we don't. Not only do we not have complete knowledge of God, we don't have anything like complete knowledge of ourselves. And so part of what's motivating Augustine in this book is to say, I've been telling this story. I'm trying to describe my own life. But I realize there's a huge amount about myself I do not understand. I am opaque to myself. As Paul put it, I'm like a stranger to myself. It is like there are other things inside me I cannot fathom, I cannot grasp. I don't understand what I do quite frequently. And even when I think about memory itself, I realize I don't understand it. When I remember, I don't understand what I'm doing. When I try to remember something, I have no idea what I'm doing. When I seek God or seek anything I've lost, I have no idea what I'm doing. And so there is something here that bothers him, both because there's something deeply unintelligible about himself, and also because he worries then, is it even possible to search for what you've lost? Is it even possible to seek God? Is it possible to try to remember something you've forgotten? What on earth is going on? Well, we see the beauty in the world that points us toward God. We see the mystery as well as the beauty in ourselves that points us toward God. We see the lack, the gap in ourselves that also points us toward God. But what do we love when we love God? Here we're back to the question that took place on the very first page of the book. I, who act through the diverse functions, am one mind. I will also rise above this power, for this also is possessed by the horse and the mule. They also perceive through the body. I will therefore rise above that natural capacity in a step-by-step ascent to him who made me. I come to the fields and vast palaces of memory. Where are the treasuries of innumerable images, of all kinds of objects brought in by sense perception? Notice that image. He wants to understand himself, and he says, well, the only thing I really have is me. I've got to reflect. I've got to come to those fields and vast palaces of memory and try to understand myself by understanding the path through which I've gotten here. What's happened to me? What have I done? Who have I been throughout my life? What I find there are innumerable images of things. I'm in a vast storehouse. I'm in a huge warehouse now of all sorts of things that have happened to me, all sorts of thoughts, feelings, perceptions. And now, how do I even find my way through this? I asked it to produce what I want to recall. And immediately certain things come out, but some things require a longer search and have to be drawn out, as it were, from more recondite receptacles. Some memories pour out to crowd out the mind when one is searching and asking for something quite different. Leap forward into the center as if saying, surely this is what you want? With a hand on my heart, I chase them away from my memory until what I want is freed of mist and emerges from its hiding places. Other memories come before me on demand with ease and without any confusion in their order. We've got a puzzle here. I think about things and I realize some things I remember very easily, other things I really have to work at. Some memories impress themselves on me when I don't want them. It's like, no, that's not what I'm looking for, or even, I don't want to remember that. That's a horrible memory. I want to put it out of my mind. But memory seems to do some of this on its own. Some of it responds to my requests and demands. Others don't. What is it doing? Well, he says, it seems to preserve a lot of particulars. It seems to lump things in general categories. I have an easier time remembering something similar to what I've just been thinking about than something that seems very far and unrelated to it. Think about encountering somebody you know, but in a context that's really surprising. You don't normally encounter them in that situation. Often it's hard to remember their name. If you saw them in the context where you're used to thinking about them, of course you'd know their name. But suddenly you see that friend from school at a concert, and you're like, hey! And it's because it's so far out. Your memory has that stuff stored in a different place, as it were, a different part of the warehouse. Well, memory is like a huge cavern, with its mysterious, secret, and indescribable nooks and crannies. It receives all these perceptions to be recalled when needed and reconsidered, but now it's very difficult. Some things I can recall no problem. Ask me to recall a certain color when I'm not looking at it. I don't find that very difficult, easy to do. A certain kind of sound. Right now I'm not hearing a saxophone, but if you say, remember the sound of a saxophone? Sure, easy to do. Other things are much harder to recall. And so, I don't understand why. Why are some things easy to remember? Why are some things hard? How does it happen that I remember not only the sound of a saxophone, but I can remember contexts in which I've heard saxophones. I can remember that, yes, it was something that I heard. I can also put together the visual imagery of what a saxophone looks like, but it looks as if those are, well, in some sense, stored in related, but perhaps somewhat different places. And I know I've seen one and heard the other. I know in general that there are certain instruments I've heard but never seen, other instruments I've seen but I've never heard them played. And so somehow all of those things are stored here as well. It's not just the thing or the image or the memory or the representation or the category or something. It's a matter of how it got there. Something about its history is already built in. Well, the power of memory then is very great, my God. It's a vast and infinite profundity who has plumbed its bottom. This power is that of my mind. It's a natural endowment, but I myself can't grasp the totality of what I am. Now, not all memories are like this. Not all memories are images. Not all memories are of things, like a saxophone. Instead, he says, look, I remember how to do lots of things. There's remembering that, remembering this, remembering that person, remembering that name. Many of the things I remember had or have a physical presence. Objects, houses, people, cities. Those are things that I remember, and there's something like an image or some other kind of representation of those in my memory. But what about things that have no physical presence? I remember numbers, I remember facts, I remember a variety of things that I have learned along the way that are not physical things. They're abstract objects in many cases. They don't have any concrete presence. They aren't located in space and time. but nevertheless I remember them. Lots of things are stored in memory that are not stored as anything like images, but of course it's not just numbers or other abstractions. It's also things like skills. I remember how to ride a bicycle, how to swim. I remember how to do proofs in first-order logic. I remember, for that matter, to feed the cat. I remember to do various things, or fail to remember in my case, in many cases. But that's the sort of thing that can't be represented in a similar way either. So the memory is something that, yes, sometimes we're remembering something. Sometimes we're remembering that something was true. Sometimes we're remembering numbers, other abstractions, facts. Sometimes we're remembering to do certain things. Sometimes we're remembering how to do certain things. And so all of those are part of what memory involves. Now, what's going on with some of these other non-imagistic types of memory that don't involve objects at all? Augustine's concerned about that. He says, when I hear that there are three kinds of questions, namely, does P exist? What is P and what kind of thing is P? I retain images of the sounds which constitute the words. I know that they've passed through the air as a noise and they no longer exist. Moreover, the ideas signified by the sounds I haven't touched by sense perception, nor have I seen them independently of my mind. I hid in my memory not their images, but the realities. Somehow I have those truths, or in this case, those questions, in my mind. I have them in my memory. So it looks as if I've got those things themselves in the memory, not merely an image of them, maybe not even a representation of them exactly. The questions are somehow in my mind. If there are things like that in my memory, well, how did they get there? Not through the senses. And so, how do I explain this? He says, I don't know how. I don't know how they've gotten there. When I learned them, I didn't believe what somebody else was telling me, but within myself I recognized them and assented to their truth. I entrusted them to my mind as if storing them up to be produced when required. So they were there even before I had learnt them, and were not in my memory. So they were there even before I had learnt them, but were not in my memory. So something very interesting is going on here. There are things that you hear for the first time. They're not already there in memory in any obvious way, but on the other hand, you're learning them, and something about them strikes you as true. You immediately assent to them. You say, yes, good point, or yes, I recognize that as true. How is that possible? How can you recognize something that you've never encountered before? That doesn't seem to make any sense. And yet we're capable of doing it. He says, when they're formulated, how and why did I recognize them and say, yes, that's true? The answer must be that they were already in the memory, but so remote and pushed into the background, as if in most secret caverns, that unless they were dug out by someone drawing attention to them, perhaps I could not have thought of them. He's alluding here to a Platonic idea, an idea known as anamnesis, that is to say, a recollection. Plato considers the question of how we know the forms. He says forms are crucial. I cannot abstract them from experience. I don't see lots of triangles and think, they have something in common, maybe I'll group them together. Then I gradually abstract away the idea of a triangle. That's what empiricists like Aristotle, Locke, and Hume think. But Plato says, no, I'm recognizing that they have something in common, and I'm grouping them together because they have that something in common. I'm recognizing something in them, namely triangularity. It is not my act of grouping them together that's then in some way allows me to abstract an idea of triangularity. No, it's the reverse. I recognize them as having something in common because I recognize them as being triangular, as having triangularity. And so I don't get that out of experience. My recognition of an experience as like that other experience and my grouping of the various triangular things together presupposes that I recognize their triangularity. But it's the same problem. I may not know what a triangle is. How do I recognize triangularity if I've never learned it before? It must be there in memory in some sense, in some very deep sense. And for Plato in the Meno, this is his explanation of how we know the forms. The forms themselves don't have a causal power, and so how do we know about them? Answer is, we in some sense remember them. They are already present to the mind. If you like, they are innate in the mind. They're already present, and we have to recall them. But it's not like my memory of other things that I can recall at will. No, instead they're in the deep recesses and have to be in some way called out. They have to be, well, we have to be reminded of them. They have to be put back in the mind. And they're there already, but they're in such a deep cavern that we aren't even aware that they're there until something brings them back.